Hurricane Katrina. And what I can say about Darren that's not in your book is that he has a way of combining strategy and heart, and art and reasoning in a way that is both, it's uplifting, it's inspiring, and it works. It works. So we're particularly thrilled that Darren has joined us today. So please welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And congrats. Congrats to you, Jane. You've made this forum a must-be-at destination. So I'm impressed.
They've made it that.
In fact, the fact that they are all here is an indication of the importance of what you've achieved. So congratulations.
Thank you, Darren. Now, Darren, I've been struck with you. You've inhabited many worlds and excelled in all of them. But you've also carried with you in every one a focus on social justice. It's just, it seems to be deep in your bones. And I want to have the sense, the degree to which it's deep in the bones of the Ford Foundation. And what is the kind of does culture always end up trumping strategy in the end? I mean, there's an organization that seems to have that deep in the culture. Say something about that.
Well, it's certainly deep in my culture, in part because of my lived experience, which in many ways has been enriched by the Ford Foundation. I was in the first class of Head Start, which was a program that was created in part with support from the Ford Foundation to help poor urban and rural kids get a head start on education. And I then went on to public schools and a public university. I never attended a day of private school in my life.
You had a Pell Grant.
I had a Pell Grant. I had private philanthropy. I had all sorts of, I had the portfolio of things. I didn't call it a portfolio then, but you have everything. You have the church group putting their little scholarship together. You have the rich oil man putting his scholarship. All of that sort of made it possible for me to have this remarkable, publicly important and financed education. And then I went to Harlem and worked at a community development organization, and little did I know that the community development movement, the Ford Foundation, had a very significant engagement with and helped to create community development corporations, CDCs. Mm-hmm. And I went to work for a CDC. In fact, a grant, a capacity building grant, made it possible to hire me. And so when I walked through the doors of the Ford Foundation for the first time, I really did feel I was at home. And I felt I was at home because the ethos at Ford is so fundamentally about justice. And it goes back to the beginnings of the Ford Foundation, which is in some ways a surprise to people, as Bill Draper here knows, because he knows the history of the Ford Foundation probably better than anyone in this room. When the Gaither Commission, which was a group of distinguished Americans that Henry Ford II brought together to really chart a course for the modern Ford Foundation after Edsel's death and the transfer of 90% of the Ford Motor Company stock to the foundation, he knew that it was going to be a different foundation than the nice, sleepy family foundation in Dearborn. And the Gaither report identified 4 areas. One was reducing poverty and injustice in the world. The second element was fostering democratic values around the world. The third was promoting international cooperation among nations and peoples. And the fourth was advancing human achievement. And that has manifested itself over the years in, I think, a very proud legacy of work that is centered around the fundamental yet simple idea of human dignity, and that everyone on the face of this planet deserves human dignity. And so that's what we are committed to at the Ford Foundation. Mm-hmm.
You're mentioning the sort of fostering democratic institutions and processes. Tomorrow we're going to hear from the Foreign Minister of Egypt, Nabil Fahmy. And the Ford Foundation is one of a very few, a small handful of global foundations, the Aga Khan Foundation, regranters like Global Fund for Women, but it's a small group of organizations that have invested in Egypt and stayed the course. And in your case, invested in things like women's rights, human rights. Say something about the role that Ford is playing there and whether you're staying with it.
Well, we were the first foundation in Egypt from the United States, the first global foundation, and that was over 50 years ago, and have stayed the course in part because it is a part of the world where people are hungry and thirsty for democracy and for participation and for the idea of dignity. And so we are there at in many ways at the invitation of the Egyptian people. And it is a very, very challenging context. I've been half a dozen times to Cairo since the revolution, and it's been rewarding each time, but the issues of rights, particularly of minorities and people who have been left out and left behind there over the years, remains the core issue. And so from our standpoint, this is another period, another challenging period, but it's not a time to leave.
Yeah, yes. We've talked a lot about strategic philanthropy here, and that's often the focus. But also the room is filled with people who want to achieve social change, normative shifts. Is our focus on logic models and sort of direct causal relationships, is that actually how social change happens? Does it happen in that tidy way that we keep hoping it does?
Well, I believe in strategic philanthropy. I think it's regrettable that we have found ourselves in this oppositional construct. And what I mean by that is, if you are strategic, it means you are focused, that you have an idea about impact. If you are not that, then it means you're sloppy, not rigorous, not focused. And so we've created this oppositional construct, which is really regrettable, because anyone who has worked in a community or led a life that has been part of that social mobility escalator that we have in this country, and that sadly is slowing down and has stopped for some, that you know that actually the way change happens isn't the way it is presented in a tidy PowerPoint with boxes and arrows and equal and impact on the right side. The idea of change is highly organic and emergent, and that doesn't mean you don't start with a clear understanding of what you want to achieve and have clarity on goal. But it does mean that you design in a different way. And one of my challenges with some in strategic philanthropy is that the donor, the foundation, the agency is put at the center. And that actually isn't the way change happens. And so change happens by putting people at the center and putting the ecology in which people live and try to make change happen at the center. And so I think it's really unfortunate that in some ways we've allowed this discourse to become so oppositional, because we need both. We need randomized controlled trials when they are appropriate. And we need logic models when they are appropriate. But they're not always appropriate or necessary. And in some cases, they're a total waste of money. And so I would like to simply say, for us at Ford, we have a conditional cash transfer program in Latin America around which we've built a randomized controlled trial, because that's the appropriate mechanism for understanding if we're having impact. But how would we have created a logic model in 1953 when we made our first grant to raise awareness about something the world knew nothing about, and that was apartheid? How did you create a logic model to get you from that first grant to Nelson Mandela walking out of prison in 1990 and the election the next year? I don't know how to create a logic model that can, with the predictive capacity and the theory of change fully developed to allow me to get to Nelson Mandela walking out of prison. I know I could envision a complex system, and we could describe it, but so many things happened along that journey that were completely unpredictable and would have never in anyone's wildest imagination been an intervention. And so I'm simply asserting that we need to move away from a theology about this to an ideology that is broad and that embraces the idea that there are a multiplicity of ways of understanding how change happens, and to not simply buy into this is the only way, and if you don't do this, shame on you because you're wasting money.
So I want to actually talk about another sort of early grant scenario and relate this to the whole issue of how do you signal that experimentation is okay. When you look back at, as you all were, the Ford Foundation provided support to Muhammad Yunus as he developed the concept of microfinance. But he was really given a grant to do something different and then called up his grants officer and said, can I reapply this to something else? And microfinance emerged. Are you set up now for the next Muhammad Yunus?
No.
That's how you ask a long question, you get a short answer.
No, we're not. And we're not because we have organized ourselves in a way to be focused. And focused means, as it has been constructed, a set of predetermined strategies that we find grantees to project manage and carry on. And so what we are engaged in now is a journey about a different strategy that creates the space for the ideas that we can't imagine and the people we can't envisage walking through the door and saying, I've got an idea. That's really hard to do today, but it has to be a part of our aspiration. And I don't know if we're going to perfect it. We probably won't, but that's my aspiration for us.
You know, Judith Rodin has said that you are one of the best guys around, or people around, when it comes to public-private partnerships. And I wanted to first get a sense of you as, is that where the invention is happening when we look at problems of inequity, et cetera? Are all three sectors needed? And secondly, as you think about it, I want to talk a bit about division of labor. And here, actually, let me just zero in on one. I was at the UN last week, and they were all talking about the importance of bringing in philanthropy, because philanthropy provides patient capital. I don't know. Philanthropy can be fickle too, can't it? And
oh, really?
Yeah. Maybe you should take it from here.
Well, first on public-private partnerships, I do think it's important to put into perspective philanthropic capital in the broader capital marketplace. And when one does that, particularly if you're a global philanthropy like Ford, 50 years ago, the percentage of foreign direct investment in most global southern countries was primarily donor money. So today, the percentage of actual philanthropic capital or donor capital has been drastically reduced as a part of overall foreign direct investment. And so you have to ask yourself, there's all this capital in Kenya. 50 years ago, most of the capital was a few foundations, the World Bank, and our ability to control and design was easier. But today that's changed. So how do we think about all of that private capital that is there? Much of it, of course, has no social interest attached to it. But some of it does, and some of it can be converted and leveraged. And so we in philanthropy and the donor community need to think more smartly about how to engage with that capital and not, again, we live in these oppositional ideologies. And so, I came from the private sector. And when I was in the private sector, I was surprised at how, frankly, ignorant people were about the nonprofit sector. Because when I left UBS to go to Harlem, I had more than one person say, oh my goodness, thank goodness you'll now be able to have a life and you won't be working these hard, challenging Wall Street, there's nothing harder than what we do here at the bank. And go up to Harlem and take it easy was in some ways the message. And it reflected a real lack of understanding, because I actually worked harder in Harlem than I've ever worked in my life. And it was because the work both demanded of me and both inspired me in a way in which I really wanted to work. And that experience is what most people in the private sector don't fully understand about. Now, having said that, it is also interesting occasionally to be in a grants review meeting on my years in philanthropy, and the name of a private sector partner, potential partner, comes up, and they say, well, what about this bank partnering with us on our conditional cash transfer? And that's, oh my gosh, a bank? We're gonna partner with a bank? They're evil. We can't partner with the bank. They're just evil. They're evil people. They do bad things. And when you think, have you ever been in a bank? I mean, beyond the ATM machine? Do you actually know how the commercial marketplace works? Do you know how transactions, do you understand that? And you find yourself in these where both worlds have completely created these narratives about the other that are so wrong. And so part of my job, I think, is to bridge, because I believe in the power of both, and I believe in the essential nature of both to actually solving some of the problems we need to solve in the world. And so public-private partnerships, to me, is a natural way to do this. Now, to get to the point of fickleness, it's endemic. And it's endemic because, first of all, whenever there's a new president, there's a view, whether it's necessary or not, that there just needs to be change. And so the second thing is that often the president is incented to say, I've got to have new change, and all of these things that are here before me, can we just get rid of them? Because it's time for me to do my thing. And all of the incentives, in many ways, reinforce that thinking. And so I think it's really important for boards to take greater ownership of their responsibilities as fiduciaries, to keep an eye on the legacy of the organization and attach the future to the legacy. But it's really hard because the incentives are about building your brand, differentiating yourself. I sat in a brand meeting once, and these brand experts were saying, it's really important for you, branding theory says you need to differentiate yourself and demonstrate why your brand is better. And it just hit me that branding theory was created to run your competitors out of business. I don't want the Gates Foundation to go out of business. I want them to be better than ever. I want them to be bigger than ever. I want Open Society to do more work in human rights than they do now. I want Arcus Foundation to be bigger in LGBT rights than we are. I want them to really be great brands and that we work collaboratively together. So to try to differentiate myself and say we're better than you or I just think it's really, threading that needle is really hard because appropriating some of these practices can be problematic. That doesn't mean you don't need to understand your comparative advantage. I understand why Ford's comparative advantage in rights is different than Rockefeller's comparative advantage in food security and seeds and soils. We could never work on seeds and soils at Ford. We'd have to have a rights agenda on seeds and soils. Now, we do have an agenda. What's really interesting is we do have an agenda on rural food security, and our issues focus on the role of women, not on seeds and soils. And we need those who are focusing on seeds and soils to continue to develop great cassava, great beets, all those things those folks do. But we know that women are primarily the smallholder farmers. And so if ultimately downstream we don't ensure that they are empowered and that they understand agricultural economics and their rights, if that isn't brought together, we actually aren't going to increase food security.
So sticking with this notion of the different sectors working together, I'm struck by the fact that the social contract here in the US is contested, right? That we have changing expectations of the different sectors. And two things come to mind with respect to this. One is when you have that kind of changing social contract, can you afford to eschew advocacy? Can you afford to get out of the business of sort of pressing government to do what government should do, advocating in different settings? I recognize that there's a policy role and that there is a government role in providing certain services to large segments of our society. So I'm really sort of trying to get to the question of when advocacy is appropriate.
Well, advocacy is appropriate today because we have huge, monumental problems. So focusing on the United States, I think advocacy is essential because the very idea, our very ideals of a Tocquevillian democracy are under siege. And our way of life, the narrative that has motivated and lifted us up, the narrative that my own life manifests, is under siege. And I am deeply worried because I think about what would a young black boy, 5 years old, standing on the porch of a shotgun shack in Ames, Texas, today, what would his opportunities be? And I worry that the opportunities aren't what the opportunities were for me. And so there was a lot of advocacy that went into creating that mobility escalator for me. Whether it be the things you just talked about, or more broadly, the idea of investing in human capital, the belief that we as Americans have held that people like me could have futures that bring them to places like the place I am. Because across this country, there are many, many, I'll focus on African Americans. As I recently sat at an event with a group of very successful African Americans, and I looked around my table, and I could point to each one and say, rural Louisiana in a shotgun shack, went to Harvard, public housing in the Bronx. I mean, just go around the table and point to the backgrounds. And with such pride, because only in this country could that have happened. And so the need to ensure that that continues requires advocacy. because we know that that very idea is now contested. And that's not going to change without advocacy.
So you mentioned... You mentioned human capital, and I think of the degree to which Ford and others have invested in social capital. And the reason I'm coming to this is I'm sure you saw the Pew poll showing that only 19% of millennials think people can be trusted, as opposed to the 40% when you and I were young. How does one deal with that? How does one address that? And how concerning is that?
It's very disconcerting, but it's also important to put that data into historical context. This isn't the first group of young Americans to be distrustful of adults and institutions. In the 1960s, the data were the same. Young people were very distrustful of institutions, of government. And so I actually, because I am a radical optimist, I actually believe that that number will change as the opportunities for the millennials to be empowered and to be in leadership. Now, the question for a foundation like Ford, as we have invested in human capital over so many years, is how do we invest to help do that? And so that's one of the questions that we're grappling with now. Mm-hmm. How do we think about the demography in this country and around the world and engaging them for the future, for future leadership, for their future development and participation? I don't have the answer, but there are a lot of models and really interesting work. And Hillary Pennington, who is our new vice president, working with us on this, and it's one of the things she's very excited about, and we'll be talking about that more.
Great. I want to ask just a couple questions about knowledge, because when you think about foundations, they are really in the knowledge business. I mean, they are big consumers, but they're also big producers, or at least their grantees are big producers of knowledge. What is a foundation's role when it comes to sharing that knowledge? Because frequently that just stays within. And do you see it as kind of part of your role to share it with others, like the folks in this room that may not be able to run that experiment, but can really apply that knowledge to their philanthropic interventions? So how do you see that role?
Well, I do think it's important to share it. And one of the things that we are considering now is how do we actually harness the knowledge of the institution? Because we don't have a knowledge management function in the foundation. We really have never had that as an area for specific content, and we will. It's something I've been talking about with the trustees. How do we, the aspiration to be a learning organization requires that we take seriously the obligation to collect and share knowledge. And so we're in the midst of a big strategy group, and I know FSG is out there, and they're helping us do this work, where these are the questions on the table. And it's a very exciting time, but I don't have the answer, but I do have the commitment to be better at it.
I want you to know that there was a small working group session that Sally Osberg moderated, facilitated with John Kanye from FSG and a representative from Bridgespan. And there was a long line out the side of people trying to get in. And we just won't tell the fire marshal how many were in there. But you've definitely got knowledge consumers in this group. Let me just close with a question about beneficiary feedback. Often when we think about beneficiary feedback, we think about feedback from the grantee as opposed to feedback from the ultimate beneficiaries, those the grantee is seeking to serve. And I want to have a sense of sort of how you go about it at Ford capturing that feedback. And then I'm going to ask you a follow-on question.
Sure. So we do think a lot about feedback from grantees and have mechanisms ranging from the Center for Effective Philanthropy's grantee survey, which we're doing this year, to actual focus groups. And I think the question of listening to grantees is something that I feel strongly about, but I also think it's important to not listen only to grantees. And I think it's important to just simply say, often, if you listen only to grantees, you will do only what your grantees want to do, which is to basically continue doing what you have done, because it means they will continue to get funding, and the issues that you and they together have agreed will continue to be a focus. And there's risk in that. So it is very important to speak to others, to non-grantees, to harness new ideas, information, data that is not a part of your everyday kind of hobby horse as a foundation. Beyond that, I think we do focus groups. We, in fact, just had a national series of focus groups around our new program on internet policy and governance, which yielded a lot of very interesting data about the public's understanding of the internet and what actually is going on, as well as things like the Kenya Women's Holdings Conference last year, where there were 5,000 women who were members of this microfinance organization. So it's important for our staff to be in those contexts, side by side, learning, sharing, feeding that information that they are gaining at sessions like that back to the office, and informing their grant making.
So we've been thinking at the Global Philanthropy Forum about how to capture the various sources of beneficiary feedback. The World Bank is now sharing this information. A variety of institutions are sharing this information. And I hope you'll think about ways in which to help us push that out, help the Brazil Philanthropy Forum push that out to colleagues throughout Brazil, and the African Philanthropy Forum push that out to fellow African philanthropists, because I know that is, that knowledge is something that is deeply, deeply valued by everybody in this room. First of all, I think it's very important that everybody in this room know that your dog is named Mary Lou. I'm just sorry, but I think that's important. I happen to be an animal lover, and I don't know why my dog's named Blue when it could be Mary Lou. So. Well,
she's named Mary Lou because our first English bulldog was named for my mother, who is Beulah, a good Southern, and there she is, nice lady from Louisiana. Her name is Beulah. But my partner's mother, Beulah, passed away sadly last year. But then we got a new English bulldog, and I said, well, she has to be named, my partner, David, I said, we have to name her for your mother. And so she's Mary Lou.
I just thought that was an important thing to know next time you walk into the Ford Foundation offices.
You will see Mary Lou at the Ford Foundation
great,
sometimes.
Great. So I'm going to, we're told we didn't have time for questions, but can I just take two? Can we just get the microphones up to just do the first two people to stand up? Because I know Darren wanted to do questions, and it's just too much fun to pass up.
Oh, there's Melissa Berman.
We got Melissa. Do we have anybody else up? Okay, give the mic to Melissa, and then the mic to Steve Hilton.
Okay. Hi, Melissa Berman with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Darren, would you share with us a little bit of how you think about not just the realm of public-private partnerships, but how foundations can do more work together?
And why don't we just take this question too, and then we'll have them both, and you can close with them.
Darren, I've always been impressed with your enthusiasm and passion. In this new role at Ford, what gives you your greatest joy?
So
public-private partnerships, obviously.
So, Melissa, the issue of collaboration between foundations, quite honestly, is a fraught topic. It's a challenging topic because in spite of the aspiration of our sector, we don't do it well on the whole. There are exemplars across the arts, community development, health, where some really very exciting work, promising models have been designed. But generally speaking, again, the incentives don't encourage it as I wish they did. And what I mean by that is I was in a conversation once with the president of a foundation who said, our board wants to know what our dollars are buying. And we can't tell what our dollars are buying when they're just in these pooled funds with other donors. And we need to tell the board what our dollars are buying. And I think that kind of thinking is far too endemic, particularly for the large national foundations. Because the reality is, on our own, our dollars buy very little. And the potential to exponentially grow our impact is increased when we partner well. And so I think what gets in the way of it, ego of CEOs and boards, the bureaucratic kind of boxes that we put ourselves in and say, well, unless you fit perfectly into my box, I can't partner with you. The challenge of getting outside of our normative thinking. We've been in Detroit, as you know, engaged a group of philanthropies with assisting to ensure, hopefully, a very positive outcome for both the Detroit Institute of the Arts and the pensioners who have suffered under very unfortunate circumstances. And I think in some ways, my colleagues, Knight, Kresge, Kellogg, Mott, so many local philanthropies, because every local foundation in Detroit has stepped into this, has modeled this. Because helping a city get out of a bankruptcy is in nobody's program box. And yet, everyone was willing to extend themselves in ways that they never imagined. I mean, literally never imagined. I certainly never imagined that we'd be putting $120 million into the transfer of a collection of art and ensuring that pensioners are paid. This is not something I think the Ford trustees imagined. But on the other hand, we were willing to consider all of the options and came away believing that this is the best option and the best way that philanthropy could contribute. And not that that's something that should be replicated, but in this circumstance, this condition, this opportunity for modeling, I think effective collaboration, this partnership has done it. So the thing I'm most proud of, that is a really interesting question, because, Steve, I am proud of so many things. It is an enormous privilege to be the president of the Ford Foundation, and it is an enormous responsibility, because I stand on the shoulders of giants who were pioneers and who did amazing things in the world. And I often read their papers, not because I want to read their papers, but because it's truly inspiring. It's truly inspiring. And people often say to me, you were at Rockefeller and now you're at Ford. And I loved being at Rockefeller. It was an amazing journey for me to be there and to work on global health and on food security and on climate adaptation and resilience. But to be at a foundation where you can talk about and engage on the real issues that keep us from solving the problems of the world, on racism, on sexism, and the fact that it is culture and the devaluation of girls and women as a cultural practice, not because it's necessarily an issue of poverty, but it is that core issue. All of the isms that keep us, that we talk about that at Ford, and we know because we know that actually is partly, significantly, an influencer, and that we can address those issues in our programs is something I am enormously proud of and feel that I have been blessed in ways that I never dreamed standing on that porch in 1964 in Ames, Texas. So to be here today with you, Jane, and with all of you, for me, is just a huge honor and a privilege. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to talk about the Ford Foundation and philanthropy.
Now way back. So, way back when McGeorge Bundy was the president of the Ford Foundation, they built the building they're in now, and they made it all glass so the world could see in, so it would be transparent. And I should note that actually Mac got shades in his office, but it was, and all I want to say about that is, here's the man, here's the leader who epitomizes openness. So you match your building, and we're so thrilled you're here.
Thank you, Jane. That's very kind. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very sweet of you.